And first of all, I would like to say that our thoughts today go also to Maria Rentedi, who initially should have given the inaugural talk, but who sadly is not able to join us today. But when we contacted Donald Opitz and Brigitte Van Tigelen, despite the very short notice, they enthusiastically accepted to give this talk, and we are very, very grateful to them. All the more so, since we did not ask them to present a keynote speech, but a talk that keep the ball rolling, a work in progress to help us to nurture the discussion. And they took up the challenge with a terrific topic: governance meets gender, retelling narratives of authority in science and technology. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce you these two historians of science who hold a particular place for me since they were at the origin of my very first publication. So as you see, we have a special bond. Don Opitz is associate professor at DePaul University, where he is on the faculties of continuing and professional studies, history, and LGBTQ studies. His current research focuses on the history of women's training in agriculture and horticulture. He is a volume editor for the John Tyndall Correspondence Project and editor-in-chief of Endeavour, an international journal for the history and philosophy of science. He is also a general editor for a new series of 5 volumes to be published by Routledge titled Gender, Colonialism, and Science, a cross-cultural compendium of primary sources. Brigitte Van Tigelen is Director for European Operations at the Science History Institute, based in Philadelphia and Paris. Graduated in physics and history, her research focuses on the history of chemistry with an emphasis on women and lone couples, domestic science, and the preservation of the heritage of sciences. Her last volume, published in 2019, Women in Their Element, selected women's contributions to the periodic system, edited with Annette Lickness, was praised in Nature and the New York Times. Together with fellow chemists, she founded Memotions Associations to promote the history of science in Belgium. Don and Brigitte are co-editors of 2 volumes concerned with the gender dimensions of science and technology. For Better or for Worse, Collaborative Couples in the Sciences, also co-edited by Annette Lickness, and is now a classic, and Domesticity in the Making of Modern Science, also co-edited by Stephen Berkwick. So now it's time for me to let them speak and to hear about governance meets gender, retelling narratives of authority in science and technology. Done. Brigitte, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Isabel, and also to the organizers of our symposium. We're especially grateful to Isabel and Gregory for the kind invitation. And let me reassure you, we are no Maria Rentezi, but our thoughts are with her right now. And of course, her own work has been inspiration for ours. We would also like to acknowledge the Commission on Women and Gender Studies of the International Union. Brigitte and I are both members of the Commission, and those of you who are participating in the symposium who may not already be involved in the Commission are very welcome to become involved and to join us. And the way to do that is to send me an email saying that you would like to become involved. I can add you to our listserv, which sends information out about our conferences and other announcements. And you can also like us on Facebook. And there's the Facebook address there.
And of course, we both regret very much not to be able to meet all of you in person, but we are very happy to see so many familiar faces and names when we don't see the faces. And we're therefore really looking forward to the exchange now and later in early July.
So let's get started. We thought we would take this opportunity to re-examine our own work. Why not? And what we thought we would do today is make the proposal to convince you of the importance of performance in narrating histories of science and technology, in which gender and governance are key emphases. And this is only meant to suggest an idea for thinking about in relationship to your own works. Of course, as we just heard in our introduction, there's lots of ways that we might think about the relationship between governance and gender in histories of science and technology. And we will proceed as follows. We'll begin with a statement of our idea, and then we'll take a journey. And we will start with the Soviet Union, how appropriate that we were meant to be in Moscow. So that seems like a good starting place. And then we will take a travel through our prior works on couples and households, and then consider a couple of new examples on the implications for the perspective that we're bringing in retelling the stories that are embedded in those examples. And we'll conclude with some provocative ideas that we hope to talk further with you through the course of the symposium about. So to get started, we would like to pose our central question. How might we advance our historiography when looking at science and technology through the lenses of gender and governance? Our symposium organizers pose the problematic to us as follows. This conference aims to study a dual process in which women are both subjects and objects of the government of science and technology. As you can tell from the title of our talk, we chose to reinterpret government as governance. Both share the same Latin root, gubernare, to steer, to rule. And we interpret governance as a kind of steering, influencing, that can operate not only in the realms of leadership and politics, but throughout organizational culture in a range of spheres. We also chose to broaden our focus from women as subjects and objects to one of gender, as we feel that the concept of gender does indeed encompass the study of women as subjects and objects. So our emphasis here is precisely to explore how we might rethink our historical practice by overlaying these two lenses in our doing history, those of governance and gender. We propose that the overlap, in fact, illuminates even more brightly the role and power of communications in the reconstruction of personal experiences and their representation to external audiences, or put another way, how gender and governance gets performed.
So performance appears to us as a suitable organizing concept because it encapsulates the following tensions. So the tension between offstage and backstage versus onstage. So what happens behind closed doors and how it is presented to the outside world, the tension between the personal and the public, and it also involves costuming or maybe even dressing up, as much as masking. And of course, masking is something we are vividly aware in our present circumstances, and in which we all wear masks for our own protection and that of others. But masks have not only become part of our dressing habits, but it actually also allows us to play with identities. Among the masks of gender, stereotypes are particularly powerful, as it was illustrated by the infamous comment made jokingly, quote unquote, by the Nobel laureate Tim Hunt in 2015. Indeed, talking about the presence of a woman in the laboratory, he said, "Let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry." In response, The Twitter campaign, Distractingly Sexy, subverted the initial message by using the mask imposed by the stereotype as a way of empowering women in the lab. And this social media counter-performance exemplifies precisely how the mask can be put at work for opposite goals, constraint, but also empowerment.
So we posit that similarly, we can see as historians the power of communications in governing distinct realities of gender and science. We thus want to visit the sites of media, the gateway, the means through which science and technology gets communicated to the public. It is at the boundary of the mask, the threshold of the laboratory's entrance, that we can locate the work of communications to construct and reconstruct gender and governance in science and technology. So we are going now to turn to our historiographical journey. Appropriately for a conference intended to convene in Moscow, we begin in Russia. And as a starting point, we would also like to honor the memory of Larisa Zakharova. And as we heard in Gregory's introduction, there's a strain in her work that concerns communications and its technologies. And we found particular inspiration in a project that she had done collaboratively with Kristen Rathi. They had co-edited a special issue of Cahiers du Monde Russe on communications and media in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And in this issue and their introduction to the issue, we find inspiration for the role of communications in a range of contexts of the governing of science and technology, not just the Soviet states.
So indeed, when we read their introduction, we were quite struck by the significance of their point on propaganda in the Soviet state, considering the phenomenon as reaching far beyond the pure political sphere. So to quote their own words, propaganda was embedded in all aspects of cultural, social, and economic life. What appeared to us so salient was the consideration of propaganda as a dynamic, multi-layered process through which citizens were actually able to engage with the system beyond the usual dichotomies: support, resistance, dissimulation, dissidence, belief, disbelief. And therefore, the need to really listen to the voice of the actors when they resonate, and how they resonate with our perspectives as historians. So to quote their own words, we need to take account of what our historical actors tells us and consider their words as form of engagement rather than dissimulation. In addition to the actors engaged in communications practice, we also have the technologies that produce the communications themselves. And Larisa and Kristen have posed communication as tools of governance, a concept that we will spin differently today.
We also note that part of the mediation that happens in communications is the transit that occurs across thresholds between private, personal, and public collective spheres. Like Larisa and Rathi, we are fascinated by how the communications phenomenon shapes and reshapes experiences through the engagement of action. And you see the quote here pointing to that very dynamic, and that there is a complex relationship between these spheres than what might say readily, what we might readily imagine. And so we thought we would revisit our work on women, gender, and science with engagement through communications or performance in view. We begin with a return to our project on collaborative couples in the sciences. For better or for worse.
We're still here, we're still here.
So in that work, we did observe through our authors' studies, and some of those studies more than others, the transformation that occurs between the microdynamics of collaboration from a set of personal private experiences into productions of knowledge that get represented publicly, and with sometimes catastrophic outcomes for the collaborating actors. In our introduction to the book, we wrote, and my Zoom is covering the quote, so I had to move you all. We wrote that examinations of the dynamics of public representation of collaborative work, which we do in this book, involve the masking of individual contributions within textual and visual imagery, projecting the work, often as undifferentiated labor, usually as the product of one partner only, the alignment of representations with concurrent cultural or professional norms, and the resultant trans-historical patterns implied for women's involvement in collaborative scientific work. In fact, what we were consciously doing was framing the outcome of collaborative scientific couples in terms of gender discourse along the lines forged by post-structuralist feminist historians. And Judith Butler made a classic statement in 1988 about gender as performance, and that nicely encapsulates the view that we saw relevant for interpreting at least one section of our book's case studies. Butler observed, as a strategy of survival, gender is a performance. Discrete genders are part of what humanizes individuals within contemporary culture. Because there is neither an essence that gender expresses or externalizes, nor an objective ideal to which gender aspires, because gender is not a fact, the various acts of gender creates the idea of gender. And without those acts, there would be no gender at all. Gender is thus a construction that regularly conceals its genesis. The tacit collective agreement to perform, produce, and sustain discrete and polar genders as cultural fictions is obscured by the credibility of its own production. The authors of gender become entranced by their own fictions, whereby the construction compels one's beliefs in necessity and naturalness. In other words, gender is the thing that is created in its very performance. Now, like all performances, they follow prescribed scripts that produce a public show, and thereby a sense of collective understanding. And yet backstage, we should expect to discover a much different scene. Many of our volumes studies in the couples book expose such contrasts between our actors' lived experiences in private versus their onstage public representations. A good example of that is the case of the Marsettes, analyzed by Dreyfus and Sigrid, and I think Natalia is with us here today. Dreyfus and Sigrid had showed the ironic erasure of the male half of the collaboration in the anonymous publication of the famous Conversations on Chemistry, usually solely attributed to Jane Marcet. Our consideration of scientific couples extended a very rich historiography to which many have contributed, including symposium participants, Penina Abraham, and others. In that work, it became clear to us that the very stage on which couples performed also deserved greater scrutiny. In other words, we needed to examine more broadly the context of the household and the networks of other sites in which households participated.
And this gets us to our other common collective volume, the volume on domesticity and the making of modern science, in which we expanded our reflection on how household science is presented to the outside world by focusing on what happens in the private sphere and how we know about it. By doing so, we explore once again how the representation of science is negotiated at the interface of private and public spheres in a dynamic that is the reciprocal movement, so in dynamic reciprocal movement that is similar to the one identified for propaganda in Larissa's work. In one of the chapters signed by Isabelle Lemoneau, a chapter on Madame Dupierry, Isabel demonstrates women were active knowledge producer in the 18th century astronomy and even contributed in significant ways working from the domestic sphere. But she also underlines that the domestic setting, which enabled them to participate actively in science, was precisely the cause of their lack of acknowledgement and to some extent of their invisibility in more public academic spheres. Knowledge production is obviously transformed when communicated, and the process of how knowledge production is transformed brings us back to the idea of performance.
Indeed, this is precisely what I'm rediscovering as I co-edited a volume of correspondence of the 19th century Irish physicist John Tyndall as part of the John Tyndall Correspondence Project. In that work, I am once again struck by the distinction between what happens privately and what is portrayed publicly. That portrayal indeed highlights the work of domesticity as a form of science propaganda. The labor of John's wife, Louisa, and the domestic setting of their collaborative work, as complex as it was, gets reduced to this kind of image that we see here, which then gets circulated in public. Although the production and circulation of such images is variable and indeed context dependent, reliant upon the technologies of photography, publication, and so forth, their composition, their staging, indeed reproduces rather durable motifs. The wife is a companionate support, an onlooker, if not a muse, to her husband's work. This famous painting of the Lavoisiers, purposely flipped to make its likeness to the Tyndall's picture all the more obvious, similarly conveyed to the public an idealized gendered image of domestic science. More often, however, the public face of domestic science masks the gendered origins through imagery like this one, the lone genius working independently in his private laboratory. There is almost no hint of domesticity, let alone the social dynamics of collaborations that were fundamental to the experimental practice of Lord Rayleigh. Reproductions of this painting, appearing in a number of biographies at Trinity College, Cambridge, and at the Royal Institution, contributed to a public propaganda of sorts, of private Victorian science that belied that practical messiness of offstage domesticity. Ironically, the original of this painting hangs on a wall in the manor house of Rayleigh's estate, Tarling Place, adjacent to another painting facing it, that of Lady Rayleigh. And she is an actor who I have argued elsewhere that was not only a collaborative partner in the science industry of Tarling Place, but also an active agent in the representation of that form of domestic science publicly. In other words, she was very much a producer of the propaganda that we see about private science. In contrast to such idealized images of private home-based science, we can also encounter a rather different set of images of public society-based science. And here again, we see Lord Rayleigh in good company with other men in beards, nothing wrong with beards, John Tyndall also among them. Ironically, the Royal Society's representation of scientific women does not appear in the public media of the newspapers. In contrast, this marble bust of the perhaps divine, muse-like semblance of Mary Somerville existed away from the public gaze, behind closed doors in the halls of the Society's London headquarters. The propaganda, if you will, of public science, really club science, association science, presents a rather theatrical scene, the stuff of lecture halls and civic venues. Here, the Bath Theatre in England for a British Association presidential address.
In this fourth section, we will carry forward this way of looking at scientific practice, adding the lens of governance to examples taken out of our own research. The following two cases aim at showing what can be done by us as historians as we narrate. Indeed, we can view historical narration as an added level of performance, and it's important to reflect on it. And it's also a way to see what the conjunction of the two lenses of governance and gender can inform and how they can lead to new insights and new narratives. So to start with, I would like to revisit the case of a female chemist, Agnes Pockels, a German lady who in her 20s investigated the properties of films at the surface of soiled water in her kitchen. And once you've pronounced the word of kitchen, she's often represented in words or in depictions, busy in the kitchen, finding scientific interest in domestic chores. Her social status, though, would not have her doing the dishes, but on the contrary, governing the household, which is another gendered role, of course, and the performance of which, however, opened up to more opportunities than the dishwashing, opportunities she was able to seize. Her home-based science, yeah, one missing, isn't it? Oh, no problem. Her home-based scientific production did fully embrace the gendered role mediated by her social status, and in fact made her mistress of her own workplace, and research choices. Contrasting her biographical trajectory with that of her brother Frederick Pockels, who enjoyed a real academic career, her sister-in-law situated the kitchen as the place of common discussion, warm and secure for both of the siblings. This was where Agnes was able to be her own mistress, governing her research as she pleased, whereas Frederick felt stuck with endless tasks forced upon him and limitation from professional expectations. The kitchen and the home by no means meant that Agnes was isolated from the scientific networks. On the contrary, and that she only had access to the scientific networks by proxy through her brother. In fact, it was again through her domestic role that she was able to connect in person with scientists sharing similar research interests. Here we have her noting the overnight visit of two professors to which she had already been introduced, who were coming to Braunschweig, where she lived, on the occasion of a meeting of the Gesellschaft Deutscher Naturforscher und Ärzte. This opened her the possibility to step out of the household and attend a few sessions. These meetings of the German Society for Scientists and Physicians, these meetings were organized every year in a different German-speaking city. And here I say German-speaking city because it was beyond just Germany, which didn't exist. And they became a real mundane and cultural event, offering not only scientific lectures, but also excursions, concerts, balls, and social activities attended by female household members of scientists and physicians. We can spot a few female indeed in the engraving depicting the Wiesbaden meeting in 1858. Even though there were no female members before the turn of the century, there was a ladies' committee of here, and you see here the list above the picture, which gathered the wives of the local authorities. And for the Braunschweig meeting in 1897, we can see that the family Pockels was high in the local hierarchy. You see Suzanne or Sophie Pockels, who is Frau Oberbürgermeister, which is quite high. And this shows also how Agnes built on that social capital of both governance and gender to create her scientific network. She not only created this scientific network, but that's how she navigated outside the closed space of the household.
The movement of Pockels through domestic and public spheres, even as the overriding historical imagery emphasizes her station in the kitchen, suggests the power of the workings of domesticity as a kind of propaganda that both familiarized science, at the same time it masked the seriousness of women's contributions. But what if, like the women scientists of the Distractingly Sexy campaign, claims that ideology is a kind of political sword? So I wish to close with one last example to illustrate this potential political dimension to the discourses of domesticity and its role in the public sphere of women's pursuit of science. The example that I have in mind here is that of the scheme for agricultural training for women as devised by Lady Frances Warwick, also known as Daisy, who sought to provide scientific technical training for women for work in the sphere of horticulture and agriculture in England in the late 19th and early 20th century. Warwick's ideas were widely promoted in the popular press, and what interests me here is how that popularization created a kind of domestic science propaganda. As one clue, the subtitle of this article here depicted that the starting point was indeed the kitchen. We're moving from the kitchen now into the gardens. Lady Warwick's program was established at a domestic site in the country, Studley Castle, and you see that here in England. There's much that can be said about how this case is infused with domesticity. Beyond the site of the college, there is also the very rationale underpinning the notion of scientific training for women in a field, agriculture, generally conceptualized as the domain of men. And I'll say more about that in a moment. And there's also the symbolism of a matronly lady of the house, Daisy Warwick, ruling over the entire scheme. She referred to her charges as my daughters of Ceres. Indeed, this may very well have been governance within a female sphere. In Warwick's public pronouncements, she repeatedly emphasized her view that this training of women contributed to a domesticated sphere of agriculture, in her terms, the lighter branches of agriculture, and thereby not only gave women opportunities that counteracted the problem of economic distress increasingly experienced by middle-class women, especially if they were single, but it also provided a solution to the domestic economy that was undergoing an agricultural depression in Britain as a result of foreign competition. So we see the rhetoric of domesticity in her very logic for this scheme. She essentially clothed her agenda as a form of domestic science, which we know from the historiography, Margaret Rossiter and others, created a wedge for women in science that both produced new opportunities and yet often sidelined women's fuller participation in research-based sciences and technology. And not everyone agreed with the domestic science approach. And in the early 20th century, the Cambridge chemistry lecturer Ida Freund vociferously opposed the notion that chemistry could be properly learned in the kitchen. These debates occurred in the media of the day, and they illustrate how the messaging of domestic science fed alternative propaganda. Domestic science was certainly not the same thing to all actors on the stage. In short, how science and technology was governed to include, sideline, or exclude women relied upon the performance of gender-based public relations campaigns, propaganda, and those might be taken into account for a fuller historical understanding of the interrelationship of gender, governance, science, and technology that we are exploring through this symposium.
We now come to our conclusion. Coming back to our overarching point, the two examples we just explored, that of Pockels and that of Warwick, demonstrate the added value of looking through the double lens of governance and gender. In particular, we suggest that by paying attention to the interfaces between the different spheres that will appear now, we can observe how the production of knowledge is transmitted and transformed as it crosses thresholds, moves from offstage to onstage, and gets performed for public audiences. We can observe the masking of knowledge and the roles of the actors producing it, and then its showcasing as a kind of performance that aligns with cultural or public norms.
With this view, we see that the domestic exists not only as a sphere, but also as a form of propaganda. Returning to the emphasis Larissa placed on communications and its technologies in the context of a propaganda state, we consider how the communications itself can be a site where we observe how science and technology gets governed.
And to extend this pattern beyond the feminine sphere constructed by Warwick, domesticity as a propaganda could also be used to promote a certain image of gentlemanly science, one devoid of all social context and the messiness of households, as in the case of Charles Darwin's study, illustrated here for the English General Periodical Century magazine in 1883.
So to close, we might ask the following questions. What can we see at the very threshold that is the transition between the interior and the exterior of particular spheres where knowledge is collectively produced, circulated, and consumed? How is that the mediation, communication, and performance of science and technology govern it in ways that produces gender-based outcomes? In sum, how does this historiographical emphasis enrich and advance our historical narratives on women, gender, and governance in science and technology?
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Спасибо большое. And we really look forward to exchanging with you.
Thank you very much, Dan and Brigitte, for this very inspiring talk. I think there will be questions, so maybe Gregory, I'll let you.
No, I don't want to ask a question. I just want to say something because I'm specialist at the Soviet Union. And after I will take some question. That I just want to say that Pavlov, in his laboratory, had accepted female students into his laboratory, and he fell in love with one of them. And in fact, they worked together all his life, and it was and they really worked together. And she was not only an assistant or the next student, but it was a very real couples, as you already studied. And it's not as I don't remember how the chemist, the name of the chemist you talked about. It was another situation, and if we accept a female into laboratory, it not only cry and what he said.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's not only cry.
You fall in love with them, and they fall in love with you.
Yeah, which doesn't seem to happen at the same time. But
love is not a bad thing, and I think this is Marcia Richmond that joined us. You know, there's a famous saying about Woods Hole in Massachusetts, and it was the place where that had a marriage office because so many relationships blossomed in that space. You know, the Woods Hole is a retreat and is a place where summer sessions were held.
Just to finish about the Tim Hunt comment, I think that the love part is not the most irritating part of his joke. it's about when female get criticized, they tend to cry. That's, I think that was the that was the gendered common stereotype.
Mhm. So I will take some questions. As I already said, we can use the tool reactions if you want to ask.
Gregory, can I add something?
Yes, of course. You have the word. I'll give you the word.
Thank you. It's just one point to complement Dawn's beautiful pictures of the Royal Society, which were from 1864, right? Actually, the issue of gender in science is performed a bit earlier in the context of the creation of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1831. And I had the misfortune to work on the first decade as a slave on a plantation in history of science. And what I can say is that this was, unlike the Royal Society, which captures the elite science, the British Association was rotating from town to town and intended to engage the middle classes and the world at large. So all the events had women, but women were not presenting, even though this is the age that one of its founders, Charles Babbage, was collaborating, of course, with Ada Lovelace. But this performance issue is amazing because if you look at the other events, you see a lot of women, but you don't see presentation. I think very, very few, if any, are on the program. Now, another point of the collaborative couples that Dawn and Brigitte mentioned, despite the fact that the two of them co-edited with others 2 volumes, and I co-edited with 2 others a volume, every day I get the impression that a lot remains to be said. And what I mean is that the asymmetry between the genders means that even if a couple, every member does the same, the public perception will be different because there is a spillover which is asymmetric between what the female partner does and what the male partner. And this is underexplored, and I'd like to encourage many of you who did not dip as yet in the big lake or ocean of collaborative couples to look there. There is really much more to be said about the subject. Thank you.
If I can just thank Penina for those remarks, I completely agree. There's so much more to be explored. And I think that was sort of the part of what we wanted to convey is that once you look at the interface of the household and the microdynamics of close collaborations with other social spheres, something happens. You know, it's that transit of what's happening, you know, and sort of in practice to how it gets represented in the public forums, you know, that we find so interesting. And I think it's that's one dimension that is so worth looking further into.
Well, if there's no other question, I really concur to your analysis, Nina, about the British Association. The case for the Gesellschaft Deutscher Naturforscher und Erst is exactly similar. It is a tool for gathering all scientists, but it's also a tool for representing science to the wider public. And therefore, as we try to evoke or to explore, therefore, the way women are presented and the roles they take, and the way science performed either in the academy, in the household, the way that science is presented during those meetings is also a performance. And as historians, it is really important or crucial that we really analyze the way the performance is constructed when it goes from the private of the laboratory, even in academic settings and the households. Well, we would like to hear from the participants and the writers of the future papers.
I would have a question because I'm very interested in this line of study through performance at the interface of the spheres, and I would wonder what would you say about the regulation, because I think in the performance to characterize the governance, there's also a question of regulation.
What is it what you mean with regulation?
I mean the way an actor can get the power of showing his or her research, or getting involved in one research. I think he has to do it following certain rules, which can be gendered rules or not. And so there's this question of regulation, which is very important, but as some of them are very socially embedded, it's very difficult sometimes to get through the point of the meaning of the regulation. I'm not sure I'm clear.
So if I could just comment, it's also how the actors respond to those regulations. In other words, there's an engagement that occurs, and that's part of the performance, right? We all have scripts, and we know what those rules are. But what do we do with those rules? How do we work around those rules, through those rules? This is what became so apparent to me in thinking through the case of Warwick and her scheme for agricultural education of women. She essentially took the trope of domesticity and used it to the advantage of advancing her program. And it was not to replace men in the field, so to speak, but to supplement and to carve out a sphere for women that would be uncontroversial, at least in the way that she presented it. Now, not everyone agreed with that logic, so what we're also trying to do is show the complexity of these discourses, if you will. They are very much contested, within particular contexts.
There are reactions in the.
Yes, there's a comment by Colette saying, "I'm sure you've heard about Herta Ayrton, pioneering scientist. Her husband sick, retired, and let his wife do the job because he was sure the credit would be given to him if he wouldn't have done it." So maybe you've heard about her?
Yes,
well,
we did.
We love Hertha because she was also a colleague of Lord Rayleigh.
Yes.
And the couple were friends with Einstein.
But it's very common to have as women are excluded from academic career. The men can use their work because they know that the only person who can get some recognition is the husband. I'm talking about 18th, 19th century.
There's a story about Hertha. I think she won a prize of the Royal Society, but she could not be present to to receive it or deliver her paper because women were not allowed.
Yeah.
Isabel, Hertha Erzen was also a very good friend of Marie Curie, of whom you know, of course.
Yes, of course. Yes, yes.
mean,
that sorry.
No, there is a question of communication that Isabel mentioned in connection with Larissa's contributions. Now, when we look at scientific discoveries of the case that I'm working on now, and we are looking why women who make discoveries are not seen as having done so. In part, it's an issue of communication because it's a case that I study. The woman in question, being Chinese and Confucian by education, believes that the work speaks for itself. Some of us do so too, and I certainly do, but it's not the case always. So what happens is that people who start to diffuse the work and have an advantage, for example, in many places, if you speak with a British accent, it's an advantage as opposed of any other accent, shall we say. And the people who began to diffuse the discovery and just minimizing that they were not those who made it, but were close enough to know what happened, ended up getting the Nobel Prize. And the woman who did most of the work, but never went on a publicity tour or never touted her horn, because in her culture, this is considered bad form. And you know, communication sometimes is very central. Women are not as comfortable historically to be in the public eye, because then people look at their hairdo, at their clothing, at their I don't know what else, and they don't pay sufficient attention to what they have to say. So there is here another gender asymmetry embedded in our culture that contributes to sometimes misplacing the credit for scientific discovery.
I just want to acknowledge the comment by Judith in the chat. Thank you, Judith. And also, she raises a good point. There were also female scientists who were single. Of course, we can think about the work of a single scientist and how that plays out in social settings, if we think about science as a social enterprise.
Don, you have a very good example. Barbara McClintock was a single to everybody's knowledge, and was the director of her lab, town, called her an old bag. And she received the Nobel Prize at 83, which is considered an old age, but she was very athletic. She was never anything close to old bag, and yeah, this is the treatment she received. And when she died, you know, I couldn't get these people to put an announcement that she died, so those who care about her can mourn or talk together. And it took about 3 days until another woman scientist agreed to sacrifice 5 minutes of her own scientific time to announce that Barbara McClintock has been dead a mile from there for 3 days, and nobody knew, in an international conference on genetics and molecular biology of cancer.
Yes. Yeah.
I think Marcia wanted to say, well, Judith, Judith, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Something specific on the singleness or
Yes, well, I mean, it will be one of my points in July, so I'm not going to spoil everything. I mean, no, I just want, I meant, of course, very inspirating, sorry. Oh, very inspiring, sorry. There was a misspelling from, no, I mean, I'm very interested in, thank you very much for your paper. It was really interesting. And I think there's a big issue on what you've been talking about couples, because the female physician which I'm working on is a single woman, but still it's more than that. It means that all her sisters are also single women, and there's like a, I don't know, some like familial strategy to have all these daughters singles and being professionals and having a personal career in arts, in history of science, in medicine, and that's really, and all her cousins also are exactly the same. So it's something like a social construction, which is actually like being single is the only condition to get a career and to be prominent in your field, etc. So I think it's really interesting to work about this, because she stayed single in a world in a scientific world of single women, but working on male. So that's quite interesting, I think. And thank you very much for your I mean, it's really inspiring and promising for the following. Thank you.
We're not gonna sleep for 2 months now before we
Don't worry, you are going to sleep.
I think Marsha was also trying.
Marsha, I want to
Yes,
ask,
Marsha raised her hand.
to ask a question, and there is a reaction in the chat.
Yes, with Anna. So maybe we start with Marsha and after Anna.
So again, I'm really sorry that I missed your talk. I came in, I think, on the last sentence, but I look forward to looking at the recording. So thank you for that. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. I literally on Sunday, I turned in an article that is supposed to be published in a special issue on new directions in the historiography of genetics. And I was the only one who took on women in genetics. And I decided to kind of do a clarion call. It's called The Imperative for Inclusion, and why women must be included in historiography. And the tack that I took for that, and I'd be very interested, I haven't had a chance to circulate the article because it was due on Sunday, is to do a gender analysis of the discipline itself. So what I did was start in 1900 and I go up through 1940s, through the classical period, and I look at what I call the gendered hierarchy within science. And specifically, it's interesting for genetics because initially, as you well know, there were, mainly women in genetics, right? And then once Mendelism was proven to be a legitimate field, that men did, and women gradually became marginalized. But that allows you to look at, the neutral playing field in the first 10 years of genetics, then supplanted by a system in which women become members of research groups. They are the assistants, there are the directors of the laboratories. You mentioned publication. I've got documentation from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory that even whether or not the male director had done any of the work, his name automatically went on the publication, and that lessened the authority of the women. The other thing that came out, what I'm trying to say is that if you look systematically at a discipline, be it genetics or chemistry, biochemistry, hello, I think that might be a route whereby all of these threads that we've been arguing for the last 2 decades can come together. And we can see that it's not just the question of individuals and their worth, but it's the system in which their work was embedded. And if you do that, what I concluded was that after World War II, things loosened up a little bit, such that you can get a Barbara McClintock coming to the fore. And she was the first woman to be acknowledged as a researcher as opposed to an assistant since 1904, 1910, there was an earlier. And then by the 1950s, you can get Rachel Carson and Lottie Auerbach, coming in as independent researchers, right? Because the strictures, that kind of gendered structural hierarchy loosened up as we moved from research groups to more a different kind of structure of research, more toward an independent, transdisciplinary kind of team science and so forth. But anyway, I'd be very interested to, if anybody wants to read the article before it's ever published, I'd be happy to share it with you and then get feedback, because obviously I'm going to have to revise it before it's actually published. One thing I can mention though about the marriages, again, what I'm arguing is that the growth of coeducational opportunities for graduate students, for women to come in to become master's and PhD students, put them into mixed gender laboratories for the first time. It's interesting because Bateson, even at the John Innes, he had a women's laboratory and a men's laboratory. So there's the separation of the spheres, right? But in a lot of these new institutions and the departments, women are brought into a mixed gender laboratory. And what happens when you mix males and females together is that you get marriages. And it's very interesting. So I could track within the Columbia, the Morgan group, extended group, there are at least 4 marriages out of that group. And all of the women devise ways, in much the same way, Don, that you're talking about, how women break the rules or find ways to work within the social strictures. They all found ways to carry on and had lifelong careers in science. So anyway, I'm pretty excited about this. It's something that I would not have been able to do just by looking at single cases. But Edith Stamhouse and I are working on this book. We're trying to finally finish up the manuscript on women in genetics, where we're looking at the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and Russia. If we can get anybody to help us with Russia, we're having some trouble there. So that's it for me.
That's for Gregory.
Well, if I
So
can.
I think that there will be many people to read your article, Marsha. I've seen many hands raising. So maybe if you want, if
Put
even
my email
either
down, and anybody who would like to communicate, please do.
Yeah. So we send you an email, Marsha?
Yeah, that would be great.
or if you don't find Marsha's email, you can email me. Oh, that's on the chat. You have the email of Marsha, so you can write directly to her. And we have also a question, a remark of Anna. So maybe Anna, can you speak?
Sorry, can I just make one comment? I've been thinking about
Marsha said, yeah, okay.
Well, first of all, thank you, Marsha, for your generosity and being willing to share your pre-published work, which I very much look forward to reading. But I want to go back to a comment made by Judith, and this idea of being single gave you access in a way that potentially not being single did not. And for me, that feeds into this idea that we erase what is happening within the domestic realm. We erase the personal. We erase, you know, the idea of domestic relationships from the public face of science. And being single can do that. But it's still part of a way of looking at science through a certain gendered lens.
Judith, do you want to answer Don, or should I?
Thank you. Yeah, maybe an answer, I don't know, because I'm not ready to answer really, but also to follow up on what you've been saying, and what is when Anna, I think, has wrote about cases of women working together and living together. That's exactly the point.
Maybe, if Anna wants to talk about us, about her case, because that will be more vivid than if I read her a chat. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for this talk and the organizing of the conference. So I've been working on my PhD on the International Federation of University Women, and there's two founders, and I'm actually gonna work on a biography of one of the two. And they they met, they founded a federation, and then at the end, for 20 years, I think, they lived together. They bought a cottage in England and a house also in the US, because they were both American and English. And I can't find a lot of information on the private aspect of their life. And I was discussing with the issue with my publisher, and he said that so far it's really hard to say what type of relationship, to define the relationship they had.
Yes.
On the other hand, there is all this LGBTQ community that's a lack of representation and memory. And I was just wondering how you tackle with this issue. How do you, because you cannot create archives, or you cannot say they were homosexual if there is no proof, obviously. But yeah, so that was my question. How do you study this type of couple, or I don't know how you can say companionage in French, I don't know how to define this. So that was my remark and question.
I think Judith wants to answer.
Boston marriage, as they call it. I mean, Boston marriage was exactly that, like two women, not obviously working together, but at least living together, with no proof of any sexual intercourse or anything, or any claiming about that. But that's exactly what happened to my Adeline, my female physician. But there were three of them, actually. Anyway, I mean, that's really interesting, I think, because you have to, I'm also writing a biography, so that will be really interesting to see what can you write on what you don't know, you know, and also because, so Alice Hamilton, on which I'm working on, had this really close relationship with Jane Addams, which actually became an LGBTQ figure. I mean, very important figure now. And but Alice Hamilton did not. And she was her private doctor, private physician. So they had, of course, she has some physical intimacy with her, and that's completely, but there's nothing on this. I mean, there's no paper, there's no even a word or something behind the words you could see. So I think it also raises the very interesting issue of what you can write in history when you don't have any archives, when you don't have any documents, and to be, of course, very cautious with the invention of, you know, like following up on small, very, very tiny traces or archives. But that's really interesting anyway.
I just want to make a quick comment. I think that's why looking at these subjects through the lens of performance is so compelling. There's a way in which we may not really know what happens behind closed doors or in the private realm, and especially if we don't have sources. Brigitte had asked me back in, I don't know, 2009 or so, hey, Don, can you do a study of homosexual couples? And I couldn't find any. And the one that I did find, it was only because I was able to find letters, where they did talk about, their love for each other and that there was, a confirmed relationship there. So that became the case, for that study. But that gets into, the role of the so-called closet and, the epistemology of the closet. And I see that as another way of representing or not representing. In other words, there's this dynamic between masking and then projecting, to what's public. And I think as historians, and I'm just gonna, talk speculatively here, we do have some poetic license to be able to interpret our evidence, based on what we're seeing in a way that we can make a case for what's happening, in that dynamic between what's private and what gets represented publicly. I think it's fair to say we don't know, but it's interesting that this fits in with a Boston marriage or a, these models for relationships.
And if I can add something, so it's also about how we write history. It is a narration. We cannot fall prey of the illusion that we are going to find out the true relationship between those women, those men, those couple, those whatever. So I think the important question here is, why are you asking this question? Was this question asked before? Was there rumors? How were these rumors countered, and so on? I think that would actually provide more depth, more épaisseur to the narratives, and it would also inform more of what we are experiencing now. And therefore the performance, the idea of performance, the idea of representation, that's really the key entrance point.
Thank you very much.
Made comments in the chat, and
yes, Marsha made a comment on the chat. Maybe you want about this question. That's why I'm taking this remark now, because it's right about what's has just been said. Marsha, you want to say it better than if I read it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really whether people, what kind of sexual relations people have, is it? One of the things that I found with the couples is just that opportunity, in everyday life to sit and chat, even over, a sandwich or whatever, about data that you've discovered, or, your ideas, your interpretation. And it doesn't really matter, whether it's a male, female, or two females, two males together, right? It's just the fact that it's a couple that's collaborating in some way, trying to understand the world. So I think we shouldn't need to be too hung up, except I think I like your injection, Brigitte, of kind of social constraints, right? If they are attacked for, homosexual relationships, then that's a different matter.
I just want to say now I really want to look forward to these these papers that we're going to see in June.
I also had a question for Anna about the case she was talking about, because she says these two women created the International Federation of University Women, and I would ask, why did they think it was necessary to create this federation? Do you have reasons? Do they explain why they decided to do something specific for women?
So that
because
yeah.
Sorry, I ask this question because I think creating such a federation, it's an act of governing, of governance. So that's very interesting to know more.
That would actually be the topic of my paper for
yeah. just small pieces.
No, so the idea was to create something similar that existed for men, or the association that were mixed, but where women couldn't attain position of authority. So what we talked about before. And the idea of being only between women was to give better opportunity for women and to show they could do as much. So it was also a reminder for all the other organizations that didn't really consider women that women were there. And they especially had the fellowship program. So that was ruled by women and only for women. So there was really this, auto empowerment, by women. I don't know if it answers your questions. It's a very big topic.
It's a first hint, and now I want to know more. I've already read your abstract, but and just a word for everybody. You will have a book of abstracts, so you can read later the abstracts of each other, so you will know more. And we have several remarks from Anne and Nina about the fact that women could not sign the books on certain periods or location, making the man the author. So it's in the case of couples. So I don't know if you want to make more remarks, or maybe we might. I would like to propose all of you the question of through your own paper, for your own abstract, how do you conceive governance of science and technology? Because Gregory can say the contrary, but I think we are on the same page, and we think there are many ways of seeing it. And Don and Brigitte proposed us a very interesting and stimulating way. So I would like to know if among you, how you would see it through your case study or through your paper.
I try to ask myself why this lack of recognition for women remains systemic, and it appears to be part of the fabric of science, and there is no particular effort to change it. You know, I'm campaigning for changing the Nobel composition and stuff like that, but most people seem to acquiesce in the status quo. And then I thought that maybe this sacrificing of the recognition of some people, in our case women, but it also goes for juniors, foreigners, and other people that belong to categories, social categories that are undervalued. And to restrict it to particular people, in case of science, lab directors. And it's possible, and you feel free to take issue or criticize, because I'm not committed to this as yet. It's possible that this is a price that science is willing to pay in order to secure the reproduction of the institution of a lab director, which is really a lot of work, and it may be a pillar of how the entire system works. You need some kind of stability, and these people know that at some point, whether they deserve it or not, they will get something from the system. I don't know, I'm not totally happy with that, but it's like a society sacrifices deliberately certain categories. It must have a very important social function. In anthropology, people are sacrificed for very obvious reasons that are considered beneficial to the society as a whole. the question is, what is the equivalent in science, in the governance of science, unless you want to preserve a unit of governing, which is the lab director, and then you commit injustices because otherwise you cannot preserve your atomistic, atom-like unit of governing. I just was pushed or forced by my own findings to look into them because it's totally irrational. But, you know, in anthropology, a lot of things are irrational as well. So, you know, I'd be interested very much in how you look at that. Thank you.
Does someone want to answer? Maybe I would ask a question. Is it only in science, the question you raised, Ina? Because is science the only topic in which there are kind of this? You propose the
hypothesis. No, science is not the only one. You're right. This can be asked for any field of governance, but the confidence that I have based on my research is from science, because there I dissected every single participant in this discovery, and I know exactly what is ascribed to people and what they actually do. It can be probably generalized, but you know, I would not feel equally comfortable to speak about what happens in a Congress or in a parliament or other place of governing. Science is a self-governing system, and I'm convinced that there is something in this form of injustice that is systemic.
Yes, Marsha added a comment. So maybe I give her the mic.
I took off my mic, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so, you know, these things are fresh on my mind, Penina, but I agree. I think you're absolutely right. And that's why I think going back to the origin, why is science masculine? And we can say, okay, you know, you can go back to the Middle Ages, you can go back, you know, throughout time and so forth. But I really like an article by Bob Nye from the late 1990s, in which he said, look, you know, it's this male code of honor that he was studying that was adopted by science and medicine, just as it was by the military, right? And that we can see that male code of honor. And if you apply those kinds of categories to individual case studies, I think it can at least be pointed out. Now, the question becomes, and I think your problem is pretty interesting. So your cases are mainly through the 1970s and 1980s, is that correct?
This case is, yes, late 70s, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you have
no,
to
but it goes until today, because I speak with people. I began the project 4 years ago, and I started to ask them, whom do you think made the discovery? And they were telling me all kinds of things that even before I got the grant to do the project, I knew that they are unlikely. And then you give them the findings, they are not very keen to change their views. They are very comfortable with a particular status quo, because they know that if you start to change, you know, you can get chaos and the revolution and I don't know what else. But it's a problem. I don't want to say that they are intrinsically immoral or unethical or unjust. You know, I devoted all my life to history of science. But it's very difficult to figure out why they stick so much to what emerges through the work of women and some men as systemic injustice in distributing or allocating credit and recognition in science. Look at the percentages in any prize. This is a disgrace. People, a lot of men get it, they were not near the discovery. And a lot of people, yeah, men who don't belong to proper categories, don't get anything. And women also, in many cases, there are rare cases that in 2008, if you remember, a French woman was included in the prize for the HIV virus. But what happened before? For a decade or more, two alpha males fought over who discovered the virus, an American and a French guy. And their lab directors signed an agreement to split the royalties from medication. And they invested a little bit in research, and they realized, and finally they corrected themselves and gave the prize to a woman who collaborated, a postdoc who collaborated with the Frenchman. And the American, it turned out that the virus he did not discover, but was a gift from Paris. So anyway, there are ways to correct these things, but they are very rare, and a lot of people are apathetic or think that there is no change to make a change. My point is that it's a part of governance, and in this sense, we are indebted to Isabel and Gregory, whom I know less than I know Isabel, who was my tourist partner in Prague, and I'll never forget that. But for giving us the framework of how gender relates to governance, because without this framework, I would have looked at this like a paradox. Why they perpetuate such a form of irrational and unjust credit distribution?
I would just add something, because I'm wondering, because you mentioned science, Masha mentions military area, but I've talked with philosophers, and I've heard it's the same thing in philosophy. I wonder about politics sciences, and also, so all these fields are said to be masculine. So the question would be, if we look at what is considered as feminine disciplines, is there the same issue or not?
It's not the same, but it's similar, because all the humanities are also ruled by men. In very few cases, it's the case that women get, you know, to rule, to govern according to their proportion in the field.
So the question is the problem science or is the problem governance?
The problem is culture.
For women.
The problem is culture.
Well, I would suggest that in all of these different fields and areas that we might think about, there's a dynamic that happens between people who are acting social scripts that create the rules that we, are encountering and dealing with. And as Panina just mentions, also, culture. There are culturally specific contexts in which we can interrogate these dynamics, right? And so, what I might discover when I look historically at, the entrance of women in agriculture and horticulture in England may look very different if we examine that same question, that same topic in, say, Germany. So I think it's, we have to look at these dynamics within social contexts is what I'm getting at, and think about them as through the lens of performance.
Okay. Thank you very much. There are many ideas I'm noting for our next meetings, because there's a lot to say.
I would like to add to what Don said is that there is also the aspect of, I mean, between acknowledgement and memorialization, there is a way in which the scientific enterprise has modeled the means through which it tells its own history. And that also needs to be interrogated, because to a lot of scientists, just doing the right references, making the right reference is kind of building the linear history of a field. And when that field arrives at the top hot topic and gets the Nobel Prize and so on, you just look back to the publication. But there is a way in which scientists memorialize themselves, which is also at play here. And I think, Nina, you've authored a short article in the American Scientist on that, showing how the memory is constructed at the very moment the scientists believe they have something of real importance in their lab, and then they start to actually tell their own story in ways that are excluding some of the actors, some of them women, some of them race and whatever, but there is a way in which it's happening at the same time as the science is happening.
Well, we had a whole volume with 12 or more historians of science in Osiris of 2000. And you're right that the way science is commemorated, one of the most important categories is not just discovery, which is American Scientist's article, it's a great minds. And if you look at our Osiris, our own Osiris, there is only one article. I'm not there on a gender head. I'm on a commemoration head. But I asked my very good friend, and all of you hold your fingers for her health, Joy, to write a paper on commemoration of a French woman, Clémence Royer. So she's represented, all the articles, including those that I wrote. I mean, I had a few lines about McClintock and a few others, but the articles, there is very little on women there, because if you write in a category of great minds, there is no literature or sources in which a great mind is attributed to women. This is another problem. Look at letters of recommendations and don't say this person is a genius. They say she's determined, she's doing that, that's not relevant. Our culture puts genius on a male holder of the adjective. And as long as this continues, if we try to see that science has great minds, we're going to find just exceptional women here and there. Majority are not going to be there. And I come back to these conclusions that I see that Don also accepts, and somebody else, Colette. Culture is the big culprit, and language, all this gender hierarchy is embedded into different aspects of culture. And every day we discover another one, but there are about 10,000, and we have a long time to find out all of them. It's an issue. Isabel, you have to look at the intersection of governing and culture. Mm-hmm. Not just gender is part, in a way, is part of culture. If the excellent quotes that Don put from Judith Butler is correct.
Yeah, that's why we would have liked to have several papers about Asia or Africa, because to have more examples of different culture and to examine the what is at work in each culture, what are the differences, what are the similarities. But we don't have, so.
Can I make one reaction to something Gregory had said very early? And I think he quoted a statistic about the number of women who in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, who were represented in trades and whatnot. There's also what we don't see that's not represented in the labor statistics, in other words, unpaid labor. And I remember asking a colleague recently, would you be interested in contributing a paper on women in farming in India? And her immediate response was, well, there's not a tradition of women farmers in India. And that was, you know, I'm like, really? That doesn't seem right to me. Well, women did not own farms in India. Well, that's a different, that's a different matter, right? They could be farming, but then who controlled the land? Who was directing the work? So it's that broader ecology of work and accounting for you know, the dynamics within that ecology that I think is so important. It's not looking at just the official statistics, the credits, if you will, you know, what is publicized, but it's also looking behind that, and then how that gets translated, you know, to the public sphere.
Thank you, Dan. And Marsha is adding something.
Yeah, I ran across a letter recently that was written by someone who was writing about a British woman who was doing really great things in the structure of proteins, you know, and he was writing privately to someone, and he said, yes, she's really a good worker and so on and so forth. But I just believe that only men have that creative spark. And I can't quote that yet because it's not published, right? It was something I was reviewing. But I thought, you know, that's really true. I think that old notion that, you know, there's intellectual differences between males and females is still very much a cultural bias that we sometimes carry, and that goes into some of the amazing stories about implicit bias when you've got exactly the same candidates, you know, up for a position, and the male is praised, even though it's a neutral, you know, the male is praised and the woman is looked over. The other thing I want to mention is, have you all been able to watch that recent documentary? Is it Picture a Scientist?
Yes.
And that, even though it's talking about, you know, the sexual discrimination that women face in modern science, still it's like, oh, that's so, you know, they talk about the implicit bias is there. And the fact that even women at MIT would get less laboratory space than males. I mean, it's just there. And that's why I think the work of, you know, all of you all is just so incredibly important. We just have to keep beavering away and pointing out illustrations from the past and carry forward the message into the present as well.
Would you have the reference? It's in the American Scientist?
No. Yeah. To the film, the documentary?
Oh, yeah.
There is a URL. Do you remember it?
I can find it.
No, just www.pictureascientist.com.
Oh, pictures. As
Picture as scientists, and
yes.
Even if you have spelling mistakes, the internet will correct you.
Okay.
Well, if you get to watch it, it's wonderful.
Yeah, you know, it's shocking. It's a geologist, a chemist, and a biologist. And the biologist is Nancy Hopkins, whose efforts led to the resignation of the Harvard president, who said that women don't like to work long hours, which occupations like science or other important ones require. And also floated the idea, this is 2005, floated the idea that, and you know, Nancy Hopkins is someone who's been in science all her life at MIT, a full professor. And this guy, Larry Summers, tells her that she doesn't like to work long hours. So, and, you know, I looked at this scandal in 2005, and this stuff is still posted on one of my websites. So you can see there all the photos of 4 university presidents in the US, Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, and something else, all trying to cope with this problem of sexual harassment and discrimination, and not very impressively.
And Colette is saying that we can watch it in France next week in English or in French subtitle. And you just have to write an email to Colette. She put her email on the chat. She will give you the information if you want to watch the movie.
But Judith puts URL. This is always good.
It's to have French subtitle.
Ah, sorry.
Okay, so maybe we have initiated the discussion. That was the
goal.
The goal today, to start thinking about all these questions, because as we couldn't meet all together, that's more difficult to start the discussion. So we wanted to do that very as quick as we could, because with the pandemic that was difficult. So maybe we initiated some discussion, and we would like you in the next month that you feel comfortable in discussing with each other. So we will ask you if you agree to share your email address, so that you can write each other on the topics that can match your own paper. And so we will also send you the book of abstracts, so that can help you. And the point is that when we meet in next July, we are able to continue this discussion, working through the papers and going on these topics. Maybe Gregory wants to
something. So, but we will give you the name of the discussant, and it will be another way to discuss each paper and all the paper together. And I think it will be very helpful. I hope.
Yes, and we already have lots of hints to orient it our future discussion. So maybe what we could propose is that if you have no question, because we said we should finish before 5:30, because we know it's very long to stay in front of a Zoom. Maybe we can say goodbye, and we will write to you this month, before the end of the month, giving you all the details for the contributors. And do not hesitate to send us your questions or your request of anything, if you have ideas, so that we could share with the collectives and improve our thinking about this question.
Yeah, we would like to thank everybody, François, the contributors, the participants, and of course Don and Brigitte for the talk, very stimulating talk, and we hope that we will see you all together in July. and we will have the possibility to read your paper soon.
Yes, if you want to send them before May 13th, you can. That's no problem.
Of course.
But I'm not sure. I've heard that men wrote more during the pandemics and women less. I don't know. But if you are ready to send us your paper, go for it. But we really thank you for all of you for getting together and being so supportive. Thank you very much, Brigitte and Don. They are kind of my mom and dad in research.
Thank you.
Yes, allowing me to start publication. So that's very emotional for me to have them. And thank you, all of you, for being today. And we will add the discussion, and do not hesitate to write on your ideas and anything. I give the last word to Gregory. Sorry, I'm too.
That, I think the question of government is quite difficult because there is a few levels to consider, and it's why what you said, it was very important for us, because it's a manner to think it, and especially for me, that not a specialist of gender history or history of women, and it was very suggestive, and we will consider of everything you said to think about it in a, we hope, interesting way, or constructive way. Thank you very much one more time.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, and bye-bye. See you next July, and send us your article.